November 9th, 1939. 12 minutes above Reckland Test Center, Germany. Lieutenant Karl Franke, chief test pilot of the Luftwaffe's most prestigious facility, felt the temperature gauges climbing into the red zone. Through the cockpit windscreen of the massive Heinkel He 177 prototype, he watched smoke begin to seep from the engine nacelles. The brand new bomber, Germany's answer to the B-17 and Lancaster, was burning. Not from enemy fire, not from combat damage. It was destroying itself from within. Frankie pushed the aircraft into an emergency descent, fighting controls that were already becoming sluggish from the intense heat radiating through the airframe. He landed after exactly 12 minutes of flight. When ground crews opened the engine cowlings, they found a nightmare. The Daimler-Benz DB606 power plants, each consisting of two 1,350 horsepower DB601 engines welded together side by side, had turned their nacelles into furnaces. What Frankie didn't know, what none of the test pilots gathering around the smoking wreckage could have imagined, was that this 12-minute disaster was just the beginning. Over the next 5 years, this aircraft would kill more Luftwaffe airmen than some entire enemy bomber campaigns. It would earn the most feared nickname in German aviation, Reichsfeuerzeug, the Reichsleiter. Within 18 months of entering service, bomber crews would be refusing to fly it. Within 3 years, the Luftwaffe's most powerful bomber would become its most hated coffin. The mathematics of catastrophe were already present in those tightly packed engine nacelles. Two complete V12 engines crammed into space designed for one. 24 cylinders generating over 5,000 horsepower of heat with inadequate ventilation. A central exhaust manifold serving 12 cylinders, all concentrated at the bottom of the nacelle where oil and fuel naturally collected. No firewall separating the engines from the main wing spar. The design that promised to give Germany its strategic bomber had instead created a flying bomb that would explode from within. This is the story of industrial desperation, how a single catastrophic design decision, driven by an idiotic requirement for a heavy bomber to dive like a Stuka, created an aircraft so dangerous that ground crews kept fire extinguishers ready at startup. How Luftwaffe bomber pilots discovered that their greatest enemy wasn't Allied fighters or flak, it was their own engines. And how Hermann Goering's rage over welded-together engines came 2 years too late to save nearly 1,200 aircraft and thousands of airmen from a weapon that killed more Germans than it ever killed enemies. Before we continue with the He 177's descent into catastrophe, I want to thank you for taking the time to explore this incredible piece of history. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us bring more of these remarkable stories to life. The story begins not with stupidity, but with vision. In 1936, General Lieutenant Walther Wever, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff, was one of the few German commanders who understood strategic bombing. While Hitler dreamed of dive bombers supporting ground troops, Wever saw the bigger picture. Germany needed a long-range heavy bomber capable of striking Soviet industrial capacity deep inside the Ural Mountains. A bomber that could fly 2,000 miles with a 4,400-pound bomb load. A bomber that could match anything the British or Americans might develop. A bomber that would give the Luftwaffe true strategic reach. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German Air Ministry, issued the specification known as Bomber A. It called for an aircraft with performance that seemed almost impossible. Maximum speed of 335 miles per hour, service ceiling of 23,000 feet, combat range of 3,100 miles, bomb load of 2,200 pounds over maximum range or 8,800 pounds over shorter distances. To achieve this, the aircraft would need engines producing at least 2,000 horsepower each, but in 1936, no such engine existed. Ernst Heinkel's chief designer, Siegfried Günther, faced an engineering nightmare. The most powerful single engine available was the Daimler-Benz DB601, producing only 1,350 horsepower. A conventional four-engine design would work, but it would create excessive drag and complicate maintenance. Günther had already experimented with coupled engines on the He 119 reconnaissance aircraft, where two DB601s were mounted side by side in the fuselage, driving a single propeller through a complex gearing system. The concept had worked well enough in that application, so Günther made his choice. The He 177 would use two Daimler-Benz DB606 power plants. Each DB606 was essentially two DB601 engines joined at the crankshaft, mounted at 30-degree angles, so the inner cylinder banks were nearly vertical, creating an inverted W configuration. Each coupled power plant produced 2,600 horsepower, more than enough to meet the performance requirements. The reduction to just two propellers would dramatically reduce drag compared to a four-engine design. On paper, it was brilliant engineering. In reality, it was a death sentence. Then came the mandate that would doom the entire program. In November 1937, Generalleutnant Ernst Udet, perhaps Germany's most famous World War I ace, visited Ernst Heinkel with new requirements. Every Luftwaffe bomber, regardless of size, must be capable of dive bombing. The obsession with dive bombing had infected the entire German military command. The Ju-87 Stuka's success in supporting ground troops had convinced Udet that precision dive bombing was the future of aerial warfare. Ernst Heinkel's response was immediate and prophetic. The aircraft will never be capable of achieving such performance in a dive, he told Udet. A four-engine heavy bomber diving at steep angles is aerodynamic insanity. But Udet was adamant. The requirement stood. The He 177 would dive bomb, or it wouldn't be accepted into service. To meet the dive bombing requirement, Günther had to completely redesign the airframe. The wing structure had to be massively strengthened to withstand the stress of pulling out from a dive. The fuselage had to be reinforced to handle the G-forces. The entire aircraft became 30% heavier than the original design. This extra weight created a cascading series of compromises that would prove catastrophic. To save weight elsewhere, Günther made a fateful decision. He eliminated the firewall behind the engines. The DB606 power plants were mounted so far back in their nacelles that the rear two-thirds of the engine blocks sat behind the wing's leading edge. There simply wasn't room for fuel lines, oil pipes, electrical leads, and a proper firewall. The engines were crammed so tightly into the wing that maintenance crews would later describe accessing them as trying to work inside a steel coffin. The coupled engines created heat like nothing German aviation had ever encountered. 24 cylinders producing over 20,600 horsepower packed into a space designed for half that many. The inner cylinder banks, mounted nearly vertical and pressed close together, created a central zone of extreme temperature. Günther's cooling system relied on annular radiators mounted just forward of each propeller, fed by scoops in the engine nacelles. But the design was fundamentally flawed. The airflow through those nacelles was inadequate for the heat being generated. Even more dangerous was the exhaust system. The inner 12 cylinders of each DB606, 6 from each component DB601 engine, shared a common central exhaust manifold. This collector pipe ran along the bottom of the engine nacelle, exactly where leaked oil and fuel would naturally accumulate. Under normal operations, that exhaust manifold glowed red hot. Any oil dripping onto it didn't just smoke, it exploded into flame. The first prototype flew on November 20th, 1939, with Franke at the controls. 12 minutes later, with both engines overheating critically, the flight ended in emergency. The He 177 V2 had a more dramatic conclusion to its test program. During diving trials, the aircraft developed severe control flutter. The tail surfaces began to vibrate violently. Then, at 12,000 feet, the entire tail assembly tore away. The He 177 V2 disintegrated in mid-air, killing the test pilot instantly. The prototypes kept falling from the sky. He 177 V4 crashed. He 177 V5 suffered engine fire and barely landed. Of the first 8 prototypes, 6 were destroyed. Most losses involved engine fires. But the Luftwaffe was desperate for a strategic bomber, and orders had already been placed for 800 aircraft before the prototype even flew. The production machinery was already being built. Arado Flugzeugwerke had been contracted to supplement Heinkel's production. There was no turning back. 35 pre-production He 177A0 aircraft were built for development and testing. The results were catastrophic. 25 of those 35 aircraft were destroyed in accidents. Nearly all involved engine fires. Test pilots reported the same pattern repeatedly. The aircraft would take off normally. 5 minutes into the flight, smoke would appear from the engine nacelles. 10 minutes in, flames would be visible. 15 minutes in, the pilot would be fighting for his life as fire consumed the wing structure. The engineering team at Reckland Test Center conducted detailed investigations. What they discovered painted a picture of cascading mechanical failures. The oil system was fundamentally flawed. At high altitude, the oil pump, badly designed from the start, caused the oil to foam. In this aerated condition, it lost most of its lubricating properties. Connecting rod bearings, starved of proper lubrication, began to disintegrate. When these bearings failed, the connecting rods could punch straight through the engine crankcase. This would rupture the oil tanks, spilling oil directly onto the superheated central exhaust manifold. Even without catastrophic bearing failure, the coupled engines leaked constantly. The tight installation, with its maze of right-angle fittings crammed behind the engines, meant fuel lines and oil pipes were constantly chafing against each other and against the aircraft structure. Every flight, every takeoff vibration, every engine oscillation wore away at these connections. Small leaks became large leaks. Oil and fuel accumulated in the bottom of the engine nacelles, and at the bottom of those nacelles sat the hottest part of the entire aircraft, that central exhaust collector serving 12 cylinders. Electrical problems compounded the danger. The wiring, squeezed into impossibly tight spaces, had inadequate insulation. Vibration caused wires to fray. Frayed wires sparked. Sparks ignited oil vapor. Oil vapor ignited accumulated fuel. In seconds, a small electrical fault could turn into a raging inferno that no fire suppression system could control. The Luftwaffe knew they had a disaster on their hands. But by 1942, with the war in full swing and Germany's bomber force bleeding out over Europe, they had no choice but into the He 177 into service. The first operational unit, Erprobungsstaffel 177, received their aircraft in April 1942. Their assessment, delivered on April 9th, was damning. The Greif had good flying characteristics when the engines weren't on fire, but the engine troubles were unacceptable. The airframe strength was questionable. The aircraft was not ready for combat operations. The Luftwaffe ignored the report. In November 1942, aircraft from Kampfgeschwader 50 were dispatched to the Eastern Front. Their mission: supply the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad. The He 177 proved utterly unsuited for the transport role. Its bomb bay configuration made loading supplies difficult. It carried little more cargo than the much smaller He 111. It was useless for evacuating wounded. The stretchers couldn't fit through the cramped fuselage, so the surviving aircraft were reassigned to bombing missions near Stalingrad. This would be the He 177's first real test of combat operations. 13 missions were flown against Soviet positions. The results weren't just bad, they were apocalyptic. 7 He 177 aircraft were lost. Not to enemy fire, not to Soviet fighters, not to flak. All 7 were destroyed by engine fires. Without any action attributable to the enemy, the Luftwaffe had lost over half its He 177 force to their own aircraft. The surviving pilots returned with reports that bordered on mutiny. The engines caught fire during normal cruise flight. Without warning, without excessive power settings, the DB-606 power plants would simply ignite. Crews reported seeing flames through the engine cowlings. Ground crews found that starting the engines required a man standing by with a fire extinguisher, a prudent precaution that became standard procedure. Oberst Edgar Peterson, commander of all Luftwaffe test stations, compiled detailed reports on the He 177's problems for Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. In August 1942, Göring exploded in fury. He had been under the impression that the He 177 was a conventional 4-engine bomber. No one had told him about the coupled engine configuration. When he learned the truth, his rage was legendary. Göring's recorded statement, dated August 13, 1942, captured his frustration. I had told Udet from the start that I wanted this beast with 4 engines. This crate must have had 4 engines at some time. Nobody had told me anything about this hocus pocus with welded-together engines. He later described the DB-606 power plants as monstrous zusammengeschweißte Motoren, welded-together engines. Göring immediately rescinded the dive bombing requirement. But the damage was done. Over 130 He-177A1 aircraft had already been built with the heavier dive-bombing airframe and the temperamental DB-606 engines. Then, in May 1943, came the moment that should have stopped the entire program. Adolf Hitler was meeting with his military staff at Obersalzberg. Ernst Heinkel, frustrated and exhausted after years of trying to fix the He-177, finally told Hitler the truth about the dive-bombing requirement. The Führer's reaction was explosive. Hitler sprang to his feet and cried, "But this is madness! I've heard nothing of this until today. Is it possible there could be so many idiots?" But even Hitler's rage couldn't undo 4 years of design decisions. By mid-1943, the production lines were running. The He-177A3 was entering service, equipped with the improved Daimler-Benz DB610 power plant. This was essentially two DB605 engines coupled together, similar to the DB606 but with several improvements. The engine nacelles were lengthened by 20 centimeters. The oil tank was relocated away from the hot zone. The exhaust system was completely redesigned with better shielding. These modifications, supposedly numbering 56 of both major and minor varieties, significantly reduced the engine fire problem. Reduced, but never eliminated. The He-177A3 and later A5 variants still caught fire regularly, just less frequently than the earlier models. Instead of one fire per 3 flights, it was now one fire per 10 flights. An improvement, certainly. Acceptable for combat operations? Not even close. In June 1942, General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch and Armaments Minister Albert Speer were visiting a Luftwaffe base for an unrelated inspection. They watched a new He-177 take off with a full bomb load for a demonstration flight. The takeoff appeared normal. The bomber climbed away, engines roaring at full power. Then it banked steeply and side-slipped into the ground from 500 feet up. The aircraft exploded on impact, killing everyone aboard. Milch stood in stunned silence as ground personnel rushed toward the burning wreckage. Later, he learned that this wasn't an isolated incident. The Luftwaffe had deliberately not informed him of several other fatal accidents involving the He-177. The truth was being hidden even from the top commanders. Aircraft were falling from the sky, and the high command was pretending everything was fine. Kampfgeschwader 40 became the primary operational unit for the He-177A5 in mid-1943. Their mission was anti-shipping operations in the Atlantic using the Henschel HS-293 guided glide bomb. The HE-177 could carry two HS-293s under the wings, attacking merchant convoys from beyond the range of defensive fire. The first major operation came on November 21, 1943. 25 HE-177s took off to attack a British convoy in the Bay of Biscay. 2 aircraft returned immediately with engine problems. One crashed 30 miles from base, engine fire. One was lost during the attack, engine failure. 2 more were lost on the return journey, both to engine fires. Of 25 aircraft that took off, only 20 returned. Against a single small merchant ship sunk, the kill ratio was reversed. The He-177 was losing more aircraft to its own engines than it was destroying enemy vessels. Then came Operation Steinbach, the baby blitz against London in January 1944. This would be the He-77's largest operational deployment and its most comprehensive failure. I Group of Kampfgeschwader 40 and I Group of Kampfgeschwader 100 were assigned to the operation, equipped with the supposedly improved He-177A3 and A5 models. The mission was simple: bomb London at night, climbing to maximum altitude over German-held territory, then approaching the target in a shallow dive to build speed over 400 miles per hour. Hermann Goering himself came to observe a mission on February 13, 1944, at Rheine Airfield. What he witnessed destroyed any remaining illusions about the He-177's reliability. 14 aircraft were scheduled for the mission. They taxied onto the runway as Goering watched from the control tower. 13 managed to take off. The 14th suffered a burst tire during takeoff roll and aborted. Goering watched the 13 bombers climb away toward England. Then the radio reports began coming in. Engine overheating, returning to base. Engine fire, returning to base. Port engine failing, aborting mission. Within an hour, 8 of the 13 aircraft had returned with engine problems. 5 continued toward London. one diverted elsewhere with electrical problems. 4 actually reached London and dropped their bombs. Of those 4, one was shot down by a night fighter on the return journey. Goering's reported reaction was unprintable. The Luftwaffe's most powerful bomber, the aircraft that was supposed to give Germany strategic bombing capability, had managed a 7% effective sortie rate. One aircraft reached the target and returned for every 14 that were scheduled to fly. The statistics from Operation Steinbach told the complete story. Of all bomber types used in the operation, He 111s, Ju-88s, Ju-188s, Do-217s, and He 177s, the average loss rate was 60%. The He 177, with its improved engines and heavily armored structure, had a loss rate below 10%. This made it statistically the most survivable bomber in the campaign. But that survivability came at a catastrophic cost in operational effectiveness. Half the aircraft never reached the target, not because of enemy action, but because their own engines were trying to kill them. Crews developed dark humor about their predicament. They called the He 177 the Reichsfeuerzeug, the Reich's lighter. Some called it the Luftwaffenfeuerzeug, the Luftwaffe's lighter, as if the aircraft was designed specifically to provide illumination for British night fighters. The most grimly accurate nickname was Flammensarg, the flaming coffin. Because that's exactly what it was, a flying coffin that announced its own presence by bursting into flames. Ground crews reported that starting the engines required extraordinary procedures. Mechanics would check and double check every fuel line, every oil connection, every electrical junction. They would prime the engines carefully, knowing that too much fuel in the cylinders could lead to a backfire that would ignite the whole aircraft on the ground. When the engines finally started, a crew member stood by with a fire extinguisher, watching the engine cowlings for any sign of smoke. It became such standard procedure that photographs from 1943 and 1944 show the fire extinguisher cart positioned next to every He 177 during engine start. The Eastern Front provided the He 177's only sustained operational success. Soviet air defenses, optimized for low-altitude interception and ground attack, struggled to engage bombers operating above 20,000 feet. The He 177's high-altitude performance was actually quite good when the engines weren't on fire. On July 19, 1944, the Luftwaffe launched its largest He 177 operation of the war. 87 aircraft attacked railway targets near Velikie Luki, about 280 miles west of Moscow. The mission was considered a success. Heavy damage was inflicted on Soviet rail infrastructure. But even this supposedly successful operation came at a cost. Several aircraft were lost to engine fires during the mission. More were damaged by fires that were extinguished before the aircraft was destroyed. The pattern never changed. Every mission, every operation, the He 177 crews knew that their greatest threat wasn't Russian fighters or anti-aircraft fire. It was the coupled engines burning in the nacelles on either side of their cockpit. Pilots who survived the He 177 experience described a unique kind of terror. In a normal bomber, you worried about enemy fighters, flak, navigation errors, weather. In the He 177, you worried about your own aircraft. Every slight change in engine sound caused instant alarm. Was that normal vibration, or was a connecting rod about to punch through the crankcase? Was that oil smell just normal engine operation, or was oil collecting on the exhaust manifold about to ignite? One pilot's account preserved in post-war interviews captured the psychological toll. We would take off knowing that there was perhaps a 1 in 10 chance the engines would catch fire before we reached the target. You couldn't relax. You couldn't focus on the mission. Your attention was constantly split between flying the aircraft, watching for enemy fighters, and monitoring those temperature gauges. When they started climbing, and you had perhaps 2 minutes before flames appeared, maybe 3 minutes before the fire suppression systems were overwhelmed, maybe 4 minutes before you had to bail out or crash land. The aircraft's defensive armament was actually quite respectable. The He 177A5 carried a remote-controlled dorsal turret with twin MG-131 machine guns, a manned dorsal turret with another MG-131 gun, a tail turret armed with a 20mm MG-151 cannon, plus flexible machine guns in the nose and ventral gondola. On paper, it could defend itself against fighter attacks. In practice, crews rarely worried about fighters. By the time Allied fighters appeared, half the formation was already heading home with engine problems. British combat reports from 1944 include several mentions of He 177s with engines already on fire before interceptors could engage. One Mosquito Night fighter crew reported tracking an He 177 over southern England. As they maneuvered for an attack, the bomber's port engine burst into flame for no apparent reason. The Mosquito crew watched as the He 177 began a shallow dive, smoke streaming from the burning engine. Before they could fire a shot, the bomber rolled inverted and crashed into the English Channel. The crew never knew whether it was their victim or if the He 177 had simply destroyed itself. By summer 1944, the Allied bombing campaign against German oil production had achieved critical success. Fuel shortages grounded most Luftwaffe bomber operations. The He 177, with its massive fuel consumption, was among the first to be stood down. The aircraft that was supposed to give Germany strategic bombing capability sat on airfields across Europe, waiting for fuel allocations that would never come. More aircraft sat waiting for engine replacements. The DB-610 power plants, even with all their improvements, still failed at catastrophic rates. A conventional engine might run 100 hours between major overhauls. The DB-610 needed overhaul after 20 hours. And that's if it lasted 20 hours without catching fire. Maintenance units simply couldn't keep up. For every He-77 flying, 3 sat grounded, waiting for engines or engine repairs. In August 1944, as Germany's military situation became desperate, Adolf Hitler ordered the emergency fighter program. All bomber production was to cease. Every factory, every resource would be directed toward building fighters to defend the Reich against Allied bombing. The He 177 production lines shut down. In total, approximately 1,169 He 177 aircraft of all variants had been built. Of these, fewer than 400 ever saw operational service. Most of the remaining 700-plus aircraft were captured intact at war's end, sitting on airfields where they'd never flown. Ernst Heinkel, in his post-war memoirs, expressed his frustration with remarkable understatement. "I even look more kindly on the He 111Z than that 1177, he wrote. The He 111Z was 2 He 111 bombers literally joined together at the wing, towing giant gliders. It was an absurd emergency measure, and Heinkel preferred it to his own He 177 design. That's how catastrophic the coupled-engine bomber had become. The He 1177B program, which Heinkel had pushed for since 1942, finally received approval in late 1943. This variant used 4 separate Daimler-Benz DB603 engines, each in its own nacelle, each driving its own propeller. 4 prototypes were built, designated He 177 V101 through V104. The first 2 were converted from existing A-series airframes. All 4 flew successfully in 1943 and 1944. The engine fire problems disappeared. The He 177B was everything the A-series should have been, but it was too late. By the time the B-series proved itself, Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under Allied bombing. The emergency fighter program diverted all resources to single-engine fighters. The He 177B, the bomber that actually worked, never entered production. Instead, 1,169 temperamental, fire-prone A-series aircraft remained the Luftwaffe's only strategic bomber. Post-war Allied intelligence assessments of captured He 177s reached unanimous conclusions. The aircraft's performance, when the engines worked, was impressive. Speed, range, and bomb load were comparable to the B-17 and Lancaster. The airframe was actually well designed for its mission. The defensive armament was adequate, but the coupled engine configuration was fundamentally flawed. No amount of incremental improvements could fix a design that was wrong at its core. British test pilot Captain Eric Brown, who flew almost every German aircraft type after the war, evaluated a captured He 177A5. His assessment was brutal. Takeoff and landing required constant attention to asymmetric thrust. The coupled engines created unusual torque effects. Engine monitoring was a full-time job. Temperature gauges had to be watched continuously. Any deviation from normal parameters required immediate action. Brown noted that he was flying a cherry-picked example, an aircraft that had been meticulously maintained by British technicians. Even this carefully prepared aircraft showed signs of oil leaks and overheating. The coupled engine concept wasn't inherently impossible. The same DB-606 power plants had were adequately in the Heinkel He 119 reconnaissance aircraft and the Messerschmitt Me 261 long-range aircraft. But those were small production specialty aircraft, not mass-produced bombers. And critically, neither aircraft crammed the coupled engines into wing nacelles with inadequate ventilation and no firewall. The AH 119's DB-606 was buried in the fuselage with extensive cooling provisions. The installation made all the difference. The real tragedy of the He 177 was that every problem was predictable. When Ernst Heinkel told UDET in 1937 that the aircraft couldn't dive bomb, he was right. When Siegfried Günther eliminated the firewall to save weight, engineers knew it was dangerous. When test pilots reported chronic overheating in 1939, it should have triggered a complete redesign. But the pressure to produce a strategic bomber, the institutional momentum behind the program, and the Luftwaffe's desperate need for long-range striking power all combined to push a fatally flawed aircraft into production. By war's end, the He 177's combat record was damning. Total operational sorties estimated at fewer than 2,000. Total enemy aircraft shot down, perhaps 50. Total ships sunk, fewer than 10. Total strategic targets destroyed, negligible. Against this meager success, the losses were catastrophic. Aircraft lost to enemy action, approximately 150. Aircraft lost to accidents, most involving engine fires, over 300. Aircraft destroyed on the ground by Allied bombing, another 200 plus. The He 177 didn't fight the enemy. It fought itself and lost. Perhaps the most damning statistic of all, at Stalingrad, 7 out of 13 aircraft lost to engine fires without enemy involvement. During Operation Steinbach, 8 out of 14 aircraft aborted with engine problems. In normal operations throughout 1943 and 1944, roughly one-third of scheduled sorties were canceled or aborted due to engine failures. The Luftwaffe's strategic bomber was operationally unreliable on a scale unprecedented in military aviation. The nicknames told the story. Reichsfeuerzeug, Luftwaffenfeuerzeug, Flammensarg, Flying Coffin. These weren't affectionate pilot humor. They were expressions of genuine terror from men who knew their aircraft was trying to kill them. British bomber crews flying Lancasters or B-17s feared German fighters and flak. They didn't fear their own aircraft. He 177 crews feared everything, but mostly they feared the coupled engines that could turn their bomber into a fireball at any moment. At the Imperial War Museum in London, a partially restored Iranes, He 177A5 sits in storage. The aircraft was captured at Toulouse-Blagnac in August 1944, abandoned by retreating German forces. British technicians examined it extensively. Their report noted evidence of fire damage in both engine nacelles, even though the aircraft had been sitting unused for months. The oil and fuel staining around the exhaust manifolds told the story. Even grounded, even with empty tanks and cold engines, the He 177's design flaws were visible. In the end, the Heinkel He 177 Greif stands as a monument to what happens when institutional pressure, impossible requirements, and engineering shortcuts combine to create disaster. The aircraft had the range to reach the Urals. It had the bomb load to strike strategic targets. It had the defensive armament to fight off interceptors. What it didn't have was engines that wouldn't spontaneously combust. German bomber crews who survived the war spoke of the He 177 with a unique combination of respect and terror. They respected its potential, what it could have been with proper engines. They feared what it actually was, a weapon that killed more of its own crews than enemy forces. For the Luftwaffe airmen who flew it, the He 177 wasn't just a bad aircraft. It was a death trap with wings, a bomber that required as much courage to start the engines as to face enemy fire. The ultimate irony was that the solution existed the entire time. 4 separate engines, properly installed with adequate cooling and firewalls. The He 177B proved it could work. But by the time Germany admitted the coupled engine concept was fatally flawed, it was too late to matter. The war was lost, the fuel was gone, the factories were bombed, and nearly 1,200 He 177A series aircraft sat as monuments to the most catastrophic design decision in Luftwaffe history. When the last He 177 was grounded in August 1944, Luftwaffe bomber crews didn't mourn its passing. They celebrated their survival. They had flown the Reichsfeuerzeug, the aircraft that set itself on fire with such regularity that crews joked about using it to light their cigarettes. They had survived engines that failed not occasionally, not sometimes, but routinely. They had lived through every pilot's nightmare, an aircraft that was its own worst enemy, the Heinkel He 177 Greif, Germany's only strategic bomber. The weapon that was supposed to give the Luftwaffe striking power to match the Allies. The aircraft that killed more Germans through mechanical failure than it ever killed enemies. Its legacy isn't written in enemy targets destroyed or strategic victories won. It's written in the burn scars on dozens of airfields, in the twisted wreckage of aircraft that never made it home, in the memory of crews who refused to fly it after watching their comrades burn. The Reich's lighter. An aircraft so dangerous that its own crews feared it more than the enemy. A bomber so fundamentally flawed that even Adolf Hitler called it madness. The flying coffin that proved you don't need enemy action to lose a war. Sometimes all it takes is welded together engines and the institutional arrogance to ignore every warning sign until it's too late. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd greatly appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. We bring you the untold stories of aviation history, the triumphs and disasters that shaped modern warfare. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one you trusted to bring you home.